September 2024 to Quantico, Virginia, when a 79-year-old man with a handmade wooden rifle pulled onto a Marine Corps precision shooting range. Elite snipers with 100,000 tactical systems laughed him off as a senile old-timer who'd wandered away from a retirement home tour until a two-star General's emergency convoy came, screaming onto the range, and everything changed. What could this elderly civilian possibly do with an antique weapon that would make some of the military's best marksmen realize they'd just made the biggest mistake of their careers? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog still clung to the valleys of Quantico, Virginia, wrapping around the pine forests like ghost fingers reluctant to release their grip. Marine Corps Base Quantico, home to the FBI Academy and some of the most elite tactical training facilities in the world, was already alive with activity by 0600 hours. The distant pop of small arms fire from the qualifying ranges created a steady rhythm, punctuated by the occasional bark of commands from drill instructors pushing their recruits through morning PT. James Caldwell guided his vintage 1987 Ford Bronco through the Eastern Security Checkpoint, the vehicle's engine rumbling with the distinctive sound of an engine that had been meticulously maintained for over 3 decades. At 79 years old, Caldwell moved with the deliberate efficiency of a man who had learned long ago that rushing accomplished nothing. His face was a roadmap of experience, deep lines carved by sun, wind, and decades of squinting through rifle scopes. His hands, scarred and calloused, rested lightly on the steering wheel with the kind of relaxed control that comes only from muscle memory forged over a lifetime. The gate guard, a young corporal named Mitchell, barely glanced at the contractor credentials dangling from Caldwell's rearview mirror. Another civilian coming in for maintenance work, administrative consultation, or equipment delivery. Nothing unusual, nothing worth a second look. Mitchell waved him through without bothering to check the truck bed, where a long canvas-wrapped bundle lay secured with multiple tie-down straps. Caldwell drove past the main administrative buildings, their red brick facades still dark with morning dew. He passed the obstacle courses, where Marines were already climbing rope walls and crawling through mud pits. The base was a small city unto itself, covering over 55,000 acres of Virginia woodland and featuring some of the most sophisticated training environments the military could offer. But Caldwell wasn't heading to the standard qualification ranges where most Marines honed their basic marksmanship skills. His destination was Range 14 Charlie, the long-range precision facility tucked into a remote corner of the base, where the real artists of the rifle craft practiced their deadly mathematics. The road narrowed as he drove deeper into the training complex, asphalt giving way to graded gravel that crunched under his tires. The trees grew thicker here, providing natural sound baffles and creating an almost cathedral-like atmosphere of focused intensity. The range itself was an impressive setup, a series of elevated shooting platforms, overlooking a valley that stretched nearly 2 miles to a hillside dotted with targets at varying distances. Steel gongs, paper silhouettes, and electronic sensors were positioned at intervals from 800 meters out to an ambitious 3,500 meters. Wind flags dotted the landscape, their colorful fabric providing visual reference for the invisible currents that could turn a perfect shot into a complete miss. Caldwell pulled into the small parking area adjacent to the range house, a low concrete structure that served as both equipment storage and shelter from the elements. The building was stark and utilitarian, painted in the same drab olive that seemed to cover half the structures on every military base in America. A few government vehicles were already parked, Humvees and tactical trucks belonging to the reconnaissance Marines, who had reserved the range for their advanced training cycle. As Caldwell stepped out of his Bronco, the September morning air carried the sharp scent of gun oil, brass, and pine sap. The temperature was perfect, cool enough to keep shooters comfortable during long sessions, but warm enough that the ballistics wouldn't be affected by extreme cold. He stretched slowly, his joints protesting slightly after the 40-minute drive from his home in Fredericksburg. Age had its privileges, but a compliant body wasn't among them. He moved to the truck bed with unhurried purpose, his boots crunching on the gravel. The canvas-wrapped bundle was nearly 6 feet long, carefully protected from the elements and prying eyes. Caldwell loosened the tie-downs with practiced ease, his fingers working the knots without conscious thought. He lifted the bundle, surprisingly light despite its length, and carried it toward the shooting benches that lined the primary firing platform. The benches were solid construction, built from pressure-treated lumber and designed to provide stable shooting positions, even in adverse weather. Sandbags were stacked at regular intervals, and several high-end spotting scopes were already set up, their expensive optics glinting in the strengthening morning light. Everything spoke of serious marksmanship, of the kind of precision shooting that separated amateurs from professionals. Caldwell selected a bench at the far end of the platform, away from the cluster of equipment that clearly belonged to the Marines, who had reserved the range. He set the canvas bundle down gently, as one might place a sleeping child in a crib. Then he simply stood there, hands resting on the bench, looking out across the valley with the patient stillness of a man who had learned to read landscapes the way others read books. The range was beautiful in its own austere way. The morning sun was beginning to burn off the fog, revealing the full expanse of the training area. Somewhere in the distance a crow called out, its harsh cry echoing off the hillsides. Caldwell breathed deeply, tasting the familiar combination of cordite and earth that had been the backdrop to so much of his life. He made no move to unwrap the bundle yet. There was no rush. The day stretched ahead with the kind of patient inevitability that Caldwell had learned to appreciate decades ago. Whatever was about to unfold would unfold in its own time. His role was simply to be present, to be ready, and to let the world reveal itself as it always did, one careful moment at a time. The sound of boots on gravel announced their arrival before Caldwell saw them. 6 Marines from the 2nd Reconnaissance Battalion emerged from the range house, their tactical gear creating a symphony of clicks, rattles, and fabric rustling. They moved with the swagger of men who believed themselves to be at the pinnacle of military excellence, young, fit, and equipped with some of the most advanced weaponry the defense budget could provide. Leading the group was Staff Sergeant Marcus Vaughan, 26 years old, and built like he'd been assembled from spare parts, meant for someone 2 inches taller. His jaw was squared off, like it had been cut with precision tools, and his eyes carried the hard confidence of someone who had never encountered a challenge he couldn't physically dominate. He wore his Marine Corps Scout Sniper qualification badge with the kind of pride usually reserved for Olympic medals. Vaughan stopped mid-stride when he spotted Caldwell at the far bench. His expression shifted from professional focus to something approaching disbelief, then settled into barely concealed amusement. He turned to his team, speaking loud enough that his words would carry across the platform. "Gentlemen, it appears we have company this morning. Looks like somebody's grandfather wandered away from the retirement home tour group." The Marines behind him chuckled, the sound sharp and cruel in the morning air. Corporal Dylan Bennett, a lanky kid from Oklahoma with acne scars still visible on his neck, squinted toward Caldwell's position. "Staff Sergeant, is that civilian supposed to be on our reserved range? I thought we had exclusive access for our certification cycle." "That's exactly what I intend to find out, Bennett." Vaughan's voice dripped with the kind of authority that young men wield when they've been given just enough power to become dangerous. He strode across the platform, his team falling in behind him like jackals following a lead predator. Caldwell remained motionless, his weathered hands still resting on the canvas bundle. He didn't turn to acknowledge their approach, didn't shift his weight or alter his breathing. The old man's stillness was complete, almost zen-like in its absolute tranquility. Vaughan came to a stop directly behind Caldwell's bench, close enough that his shadow fell across the old man's workspace. "Excuse me, sir. I'm going to need to see your range authorization paperwork. This facility is reserved for active duty personnel conducting advanced marksmanship training." Caldwell turned slowly, his movements economical and unhurried. His pale blue eyes met Vaughan's dark ones, with a directness that momentarily unsettled the younger man. "Good morning, Staff Sergeant," Caldwell said, his voice carrying the gravelly texture of decades of cigarette smoke long since quit. "I have a standing contractor agreement with base operations. You're welcome to verify it with the Range Control Office." "A contractor agreement?" Vaughan's eyebrows rose in theatrical disbelief. "What exactly are you contracted to do?" "Test equipment. For the Senior Citizen Shooting League." The Marines behind him laughed louder this time, emboldened by their leader's mockery. Lance Corporal Jackson Reeves, a stocky kid from Detroit who'd been trying to grow a mustache for 6 months with minimal success, stepped closer to get a better look at Caldwell's setup. "What's in the sleeping bag there, old-timer? Did you bring your lunch?" Reeves reached out toward the canvas bundle, his fingers hovering inches from the fabric. For the first time, something flickered in Caldwell's eyes. It wasn't anger exactly, but rather a sudden focusing, like a camera lens snapping into perfect clarity. "I'd appreciate it if you kept your hands to yourself, son." The words were quiet, almost gentle, but they carried a weight that made Reeves pull his hand back as if he'd nearly touched a hot stove. There was something in the old man's tone, something that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to the primitive part of the brain that recognizes genuine danger. Vaughan noticed the exchange and didn't like it. He didn't like that this elderly civilian had somehow made one of his Marines back down without raising his voice. He stepped around the bench to position himself directly in front of Caldwell, deliberately invading the old man's personal space. "Let me make this simple for you, sir," Vaughan said, his voice hardening. "This is a professional training environment for the most elite marksmen in the United States Marine Corps. We're conducting precision long-range shooting exercises with state-of-the-art weapons systems." He gestured toward the expensive rifles his team had begun unpacking. Barrett M82A1s, LaRue OBR systems, custom-built precision rifles with optics worth more than most people's cars. "I don't know what kind of hunting trip you think you're on, but unless you've got some serious credentials, I'm going to have to ask you to pack up whatever antique you're hauling around and clear out. We've got real work to do." Caldwell studied Vaughan for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he reached down and began unwrapping the canvas bundle. His fingers worked methodically, peeling back layers of protective fabric with the kind of care usually reserved for museum artifacts. The rifle that emerged made Corporal Bennett actually laugh out loud, a sharp, disbelieving bark that echoed across the range. It was made almost entirely of wood. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The stock was hand-carved from what looked like walnut, rich and dark with age. The forestock extended the full length of the barrel, traditional style, with obvious hand-tooling marks still visible in the grain. There was no synthetic polymer, no carbon fiber, no anodized aluminum. The metal components, barrel, receiver, trigger assembly, appeared to be blued steel, maintained to perfection but utterly devoid of modern tactical accessories. No bipod mount, no Picatinny rails, no scope with digital ranging capabilities. Just wood and steel, like something that belonged in a museum display case labeled Early American Firearms, 1850-1900. "You have got to be kidding me," Vaughan breathed, his voice a mixture of astonishment and derision. He turned to his team, gesturing at the rifle with theatrical disbelief. "Gentlemen, I want you to take a good look at this. This is what happens when you don't keep up with technological advancement. This man brought a piece of firewood to a precision shooting range." Reeves stepped closer, openly staring at the wooden rifle. "Is that thing even safe to fire? It looks like something my great-grandfather would have used to hunt deer in the 1940s. Probably shoots black powder," Bennett added, still grinning. "Maybe we should stand back in case it explodes." Private. First Class Aaron Briggs, the youngest of the group at barely 20 years old, pulled out his phone and started taking pictures. "This is going straight to the battalion group chat. Nobody's going to believe this." Vaughan crossed his arms, his expression settling into something between pity and contempt. "Sir, with all due respect, you're out of your depth here. We're preparing for certification standards that require sub-MOA accuracy at distances exceeding 1,500 meters. That wooden toy might be fine for shooting cans off a fence post, but it has no business on a professional military range." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a reasonable, almost kind tone. "I'm trying to be polite about this. Nobody wants to see you embarrass yourself. Why don't you pack up your equipment, head back to whatever gun club you came from, and let the professionals handle the real shooting?" Caldwell's hands rested on the wooden stock of his rifle, his calloused fingers tracing patterns in the grain that he'd memorized decades ago. He looked up at Vaughan with those pale blue eyes, and for just a moment, something ancient and hard flickered in their depths, something that suggested this old man had looked at targets far more dangerous than paper silhouettes in his lifetime. "Staff Sergeant," Caldwell said quietly, "I appreciate your concern, but I think I'll stay." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and the morning suddenly felt several degrees colder. Master Gunnery Sergeant Vincent Raleigh had been running the armory and range operations at Quantico for the past 11 years. At 47, with close-cropped grey hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as Mount Rushmore, Raleigh had seen enough Marines come through his doors to recognize patterns that younger men missed. He was the kind of senior NCO who noticed everything, the slight hitch in a recruit's stride that indicated a developing stress fracture, the micro-expression on a lieutenant's face that revealed doubt, the subtle tells that separated confident Marines from those just pretending. This particular morning, he was reviewing range reservation logs in his small office adjacent to the main armory when something caught his attention. Range 14 Charlie, Civilian Contractor Access. The name on the authorization form made him pause mid-sip of his coffee. James Caldwell. Raleigh set his mug down slowly, his mind racing backward through decades of half-forgotten briefings, classified operations summaries, and late-night conversations with old-timers who'd served in conflicts that most modern Marines only read about in history books. The name triggered something deep in his memory, like a stone dropped into a well, the ripples spreading outward until they connected with something substantial. He swiveled in his chair and pulled open the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet, retrieving a worn 3-ring binder marked Base Historical Records, Civilian Consultants and DoD Contractors. Dow. The binder was ancient, its pages yellowed, and some entries still typewritten on actual typewriter paper rather than computer printouts. Raleigh flipped through sections, his thick fingers surprisingly gentle with the fragile documents. There, page 127, a faded photograph clipped to a personnel summary sheet. The photo showed a much younger man, maybe in his late 30s, standing in desert camouflage that predated the current digital patterns by several generations. The man held a rifle, and even in the grainy black and white photo, Raleigh could see it was made of wood. The same sharp eyes looked out from that younger face, recognizable even across 40 years of aging. Raleigh's eyes moved to the text below the photograph, and his blood pressure began to rise as he read. Project Designation, Ghost Walker. Classification Level, TSSCI. Operational Theater Multiple Redacted. Primary Role, Long-Range Reconnaissance and Counter-Sniper Operations. Notable achievements. See Appendix C. Restricted access. Holy shit, Raleigh whispered to the empty office. His hands were shaking slightly as he reached for the secure phone on his desk. Not the regular landline, but the encrypted line that connected directly to the base operations center. He punched in the extension for the watch officer with more force than necessary. Operations, Captain Suzuki speaking. Captain, this is Master Guns Raleigh at the Range Armory. I need you to run a deep background check for me. Full military history database search. Name is James Caldwell, civilian contractor currently on Range 14 Charlie. Raleigh's voice was tight with urgency. There was a pause on the other end. Master Guns, I've got regular contractors in and out of here all day. What's the priority on this? Sir, just trust me and run the search. I think we might have a situation developing that needs immediate command attention. Raleigh could hear typing in the background. Then silence, then more typing, faster now. Master Guns. Captain Suzuki's voice had changed, becoming sharper, more focused. I'm hitting security flags on this name. Multiple classification barriers. This isn't a standard contractor file. It's compartmentalized under Special Projects Division. I need authorization codes so I don't have to access the full record. Can you see anything? Any basic service information? More typing. I'm seeing. Jesus Christ, Master Guns. I'm seeing combat service markers going back to 1968, Vietnam era, then gaps in the record, then flags for DoD special projects starting in the 70s and running through. Suzuki's voice trailed off. This can't be right. The last entry shows active consultation status as recently as 2019. That's a 50-year operational history, Raleigh said, his voice grim. Captain, I need you to contact the base commander immediately. I don't care if Colonel Patterson is in a meeting. This is my priority. Master Guns, what exactly is happening on that range? Raleigh looked down at the old photograph again, at the young man with the wooden rifle standing in some desert that might have been Vietnam, might have been Chad, might have been any of a dozen forgotten battlefields where Americans fought wars that never made the evening news. I think some of our reconnaissance Marines are about to make the biggest mistake of their careers, Raleigh said quietly, and I think they're doing it right now. At Range 14 Charlie, Vaughn had returned to his team's shooting positions, but he kept glancing back at Caldwell with a mixture of annoyance and amusement. The old man had simply ignored their mockery and was now methodically setting up his wooden rifle on the bench rest, his movements precise and unhurried. Staff Sergeant, should we actually let him shoot? Bennett asked, adjusting the scope on his LaRue tactical rifle. I mean, if that antique blows up, it could shut down the range for the rest of the day while they investigate. Vaughn considered this, then shrugged. Let the old man have his fun. When he embarrasses himself, maybe he'll finally pack it up and leave. Besides, I want to see just how badly that museum piece performs compared to real equipment. What none of them noticed was Master Gunnery Sergeant Raleigh's pickup truck racing down the gravel access road at a speed that sent stones flying and dust billowing in a long trail behind him. Raleigh's face was set in grim determination, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. In the base commander's office, Colonel William Patterson set down his coffee and looked at Captain Suzuki with an expression of disbelief. Say that name again. James Caldwell, sir. He's currently on Range 14 Charlie as a civilian contractor. Master Guns Raleigh flagged his presence as potentially significant. Patterson's jaw tightened. He was 52 years old and had commanded Marine installations for over a decade, but his memory was sharp enough to recall briefings he'd received as a young captain serving on the Joint Chiefs staff. Briefings about operations that officially never happened, about specialists who existed in the murky world between civilian and military. Between acknowledged and classified, he'd heard the name Caldwell exactly once before, in a closed-door session about the evolution of military sniper tactics. The briefing officer, a colonel from Marine Corps Intelligence, had mentioned a civilian consultant who'd pioneered techniques that were still classified 30 years after their development. A man who'd operated in conflicts spanning 5 decades. A legend who'd supposedly walked away from it all in the early 2000s. "Get me the vehicle," Patterson said, standing abruptly. "And contact Major General Claire Addison's office at Marine Corps Combat Development Command. Tell her staff that Caldwell is here. They'll know who I'm talking about." Suzuki's eyes widened. "Sir, the General is—" "I know exactly who she is, Captain. And if half of what I remember about James Caldwell is true, she'll want to know that one of her Marines is currently harassing a living legend." Patterson grabbed his service cover and headed for the door, his mind already racing ahead to the scene he knew he was about to witness. "And Captain, tell them to hurry. Something tells me we're running out of time to prevent a very public embarrassment for everyone involved." As Patterson's staff car roared to life outside, Master Gunnery Sergeant Raleigh was already pulling into the Range 14 Charlie parking area, his boots hitting the gravel before his truck had fully stopped rolling. The confrontation was about to reach its breaking point, and the people who understood what was really happening were racing against time to intervene before something irreversible occurred. The morning sun climbed higher in the Virginia sky. Indifferent to the human drama unfolding below, the sound came first, a deep, mechanical roar that grew from distant rumble to thunderous presence in less than 30 seconds. Every head on Range 14. Charlie turned toward the access road as a massive cloud of red Virginia dust erupted into the morning sky like a signal flare. 3 black Chevrolet Suburbans with government plates emerged from the dust cloud, their engines screaming as they accelerated past the normal speed restrictions. Leading the convoy was Colonel Patterson's command vehicle, a dark blue Ford Explorer with base commander flags mounted on the front fenders. Behind that came a vehicle that made even Vaughan's confident smirk falter, a Suburban with 2-star flags and Marine Corps Combat Development Command insignia on the doors. The convoy didn't slow down. It didn't use the parking area. The vehicles drove directly onto the range's graded shooting platform, their heavy tires chewing into the carefully maintained gravel before slamming to simultaneous stops in a choreographed display of urgency that sent stones clattering. Across the concrete benches, doors flew open before the engines even cut off. Master Gunnery Sergeant Raleigh emerged from the lead Suburban, his face set in an expression somewhere between fury and terror. He'd made it to the base commander's convoy just as it was departing, and Patterson had waved him into the vehicle without a word. The look the colonel had given him during the drive suggested that Raleigh's instincts had been correct and that the situation was potentially even worse than he'd feared. Colonel Patterson stepped out next, his uniform immaculate despite the violent drive, his jaw set in a hard line. He was a tall man, 6'3", with the bearing of someone who'd spent 30 years learning how to command respect through presence alone. His eyes swept the range, taking in the scene with the trained assessment of a combat veteran. But it was the figure who emerged from the second Suburban that caused the air itself to seem to crystallize. Major General Claire Addison was 58 years old and looked like she could still outrun, outshoot and outthink most of the Marines half her age. Her silver hair was cut in a regulation style that somehow managed to be both severe and elegant. 2 stars gleamed on her collar, but it wasn't the rank insignia that commanded attention. It was the way she moved, with absolute confidence and zero tolerance for incompetence. She'd earned her stars the hard way, through combat deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, through innovation in tactical development, and through a reputation for brutal honesty that had derailed the careers of officers who thought rank meant they could stop learning. She was also the commanding officer of Marine Corps Combat Development Command, which meant she oversaw the development of every tactical doctrine, every training program, and every piece of equipment innovation the Marine Corps adopted. If you wanted to change how Marines fought, you went through Claire Addison, and she looked absolutely furious. The entire range had fallen into shocked silence. Vaughn stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, his brain trying to process why a two-star general had just arrived on his training range like it was a hot combat zone. His team had unconsciously drawn together, their earlier swagger evaporating like morning dew under the suddenly intense scrutiny. General Addison's boots struck the ground with sharp, purposeful impacts as she walked directly toward the shooting benches. She didn't look at Vaughn. She didn't acknowledge any of the young Marines standing at various stages of attention. Her eyes locked onto one person and one person only. James Caldwell stood slowly from his bench, his weathered face breaking into the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him that morning. "Claire," he said simply, his gravelly voice warm with recognition. "James," she replied, her stern expression softening slightly. Then she turned to face the assembled Marines, and the softness vanished like it had never existed. "I'm going to ask this once," General Addison said, her voice cutting across the range with the precision of a scalpel. "Which one of you thought it was appropriate to harass this man?" The silence was absolute. Even the wind seemed to have stopped blowing. Somewhere in the distance a bird called out, its cry sounding obscenely loud in the sudden quiet. Vaughn's throat worked silently for a moment before he managed to find his voice. "Ma'am, we were simply trying to maintain range safety and professional standards. The weapon appeared to be—" "I didn't ask for excuses, Staff Sergeant." Addison's interruption was surgical. "I asked who harassed him." Vaughn's face had gone pale. "Ma'am, that was me, ma'am." Colonel Patterson moved to stand beside the general, his own expression thunderous. Master Gunnery Sergeant Raleigh positioned himself slightly behind them, his eyes boring into Vaughn with an intensity that promised a very uncomfortable conversation in the near future. General Addison let the silence stretch for another long moment before she spoke again. "Staff Sergeant Vaughn, do you know who this man is?" "No, ma'am." "He presented as a civilian contractor with range access authorization." "That authorization," Addison said, her voice dropping to a deadly quiet that was somehow more terrifying than shouting, "is a standing order signed by the Commandant of the Marine Corps himself. It grants James Caldwell unrestricted access to any Marine Corps training facility, any time for any purpose he deems necessary." She took a step closer to Vaughn, and the young sergeant actually flinched. "This man, this civilian contractor you saw fit to mock, is James Caldwell. Does that name mean anything to you?" Vaughn shook his head mutely. "Then allow me to educate you," Addison continued, her voice taking on the cadence of a lecture that would not soon be forgotten. "James Caldwell served in Vietnam as a Marine Corps scout sniper. He has more confirmed kills than any sniper in Marine Corps history. After his active service, he became a special projects consultant for the Department of Defense, a position he held for 43 years. She gestured toward the wooden rifle on Caldwell's bench. "That wooden rifle you found so amusing is the prototype for advanced ballistic systems that are still classified. He built it by hand in 1971 while embedded with a special operations team in Laos. With that weapon, he achieved kills at ranges that modern snipers with $100,000 systems still struggle to match." Corporal Bennett's face had gone from pale to green. Private Briggs was staring at his boots like he wished the earth would open and swallow him. Reeves looked like he might actually be sick. General Addison wasn't finished. Mr. Caldwell pioneered techniques in long-range precision shooting that are now standard doctrine taught to every Marine Scout sniper. He developed the mathematical models for wind calculation that you probably learned in sniper school. He advised on the development of the M40 rifle system, the M110, and the MK13. He has trained more than 300 snipers who went on to combat deployments." She paused, letting each word land like a hammer blow. "And this morning you mocked him. You laughed at his equipment. You questioned his credentials. You suggested he leave a range that he has more right to use than any of you will ever have." Colonel Patterson stepped forward. his voice hard as iron. "Staff Sergeant Vaughan, you and your team will remain on this range. You will observe what happens next, and when it's over, you will report to my office for what I promise will be the most unpleasant conversation of your Marine Corps career." General Addison turned back to Caldwell, and her expression softened again. "James, I apologize for the disrespect shown to you this morning. These Marines forgot a fundamental lesson that I'm about to reteach them." She raised her voice so everyone on the range could hear clearly. "Never judge a warrior by the shine of his weapon. Judge him by what he can do with it." She gestured toward the valley, stretching out before them. "Would you mind giving us a demonstration?" James Caldwell smiled, a quiet expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'd be happy to, Claire." The old man turned back to his wooden rifle, and the morning suddenly felt charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the weather. James Caldwell approached his wooden rifle with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. His weathered hands moved across the stock, checking elements invisible to untrained eyes. The grain pattern he'd memorized 5 decades ago, the slight wear marks that told him exactly how the weapon would behave. The precise balance point that separated this rifle from every modern tactical system on the range. General Addison pulled a tactical radio from her belt and keyed the transmit button. "Range control, this is Addison. I need the electronic target array activated at range 14 Charlie. Maximum distance configuration." A crackle of static, then a confused voice responded. "Ma'am, maximum distance? That's the 3 200-meter targets. Those are only activated for special certification protocols. I'm aware of what they're used for, Sergeant." "Activate them now." "Yes, ma'am." Target array coming online, far down the valley, beyond the standard 800 and 200-meter markers that Vaughan's team had planned to use. A series of electronic panels began to glow with soft LED indicators. The 3 200-meter targets were barely visible to the naked eye, appearing as small, dark rectangles against the hillside backdrop. Most Marines never shot at these distances during standard training. The targets existed primarily for experimental weapons testing and elite-level certification courses. Colonel Patterson moved to the observation bench where a high-powered spotting scope was mounted. Master Gunnery Sergeant Raleigh stood beside him, his own binoculars trained downrange. Vaughan and his team clustered awkwardly to one side, no longer confident observers, but unwilling participants in a lesson they were beginning to understand would be painful. Caldwell settled into a shooting position behind his wooden rifle. He didn't use the modern shooting bags and rests that littered the other benches. Instead, he produced from his truck a worn leather shooting jacket that looked older than most of the Marines watching him. The leather was scarred and faded, darkened in places by decades of gun oil and sweat. He slipped it on with practiced ease, the garment fitting him like a second skin. His movements were economical, stripped of any unnecessary motion. He checked the rifle's action, a smooth bolt mechanism that cycled with the precision of Swiss watchmaking. The metallic click as he worked the bolt carried clearly across the suddenly silent range. "What's the wind call, Master Guns?" Caldwell asked, his voice calm and conversational. Raleigh consulted the wind meters positioned along the range. "Reading 3 to 5 miles per hour, variable from the northeast. Switching to east-northeast in the mid-range zone. Temperature is 68 degrees Fahrenheit, barometric pressure 30.12, and rising." Caldwell nodded, absorbing the information without writing anything down. His eyes tracked the wind flags dotting the valley, reading the invisible currents, like a sailor reading ocean swells. Those flags told a more complex story than any electronic meter. The wind wasn't constant, but breathing, pulsing in patterns that repeated on a rhythm, measured in heartbeats rather than minutes. He reached into a small wooden box beside his bench and withdrew a single cartridge. The brass casing gleamed with careful maintenance, but the bullet itself was unusual, a custom-made projectile that looked hand-turned on a lathe. Because it had been. In 1971, in a makeshift workshop in Laos, Caldwell had learned to manufacture his own ammunition when military supply chains proved unreliable. The knowledge had never left him. The cartridge slid into the chamber with a satisfying snick. Caldwell worked the bolt closed, the rifle now ready to fire. The 3-200-meter target is a 12-inch square, General Addison announced, speaking to the assembled Marines, but keeping her eyes on Caldwell. In modern military terms, that's approximately the size of a human head at that distance. It's considered one of the most difficult shots in precision marksmanship. The bullet drop at this range is approximately 875 inches. That's over 72 feet. The bullet will be in flight for approximately 4 seconds. During that time, it will be affected by gravity, the wind drift, Coriolis effect, and air density variations. She paused, letting the mathematics sink in. Most modern snipers, using the finest equipment available, will achieve a 30 to 40% success rate at this distance under ideal conditions. The current Marine Corps record for consecutive hits at 3-200 meters is 3 out of 10 attempts. Vaughan's expensive LaRue rifle, sitting abandoned on his bench, suddenly looked less impressive. He found himself doing the mental calculations. His personal best shot had been 1/800 meters, and that had taken him 6 attempts to achieve a solid hit. The idea of doubling that distance with a wooden rifle seemed to defy physics. Caldwell's breathing had slowed. His chest rose and fell with deliberate rhythm, each breath controlled and measured. He settled his cheek against the wooden stock, his eye finding the scope, a simple fixed-power optic that looked antique compared to the variable magnification tactical scopes the young Marines used. The range fell into absolute silence. Even the birds seemed to have stopped calling. 27 people held their collective breath, watching an old man with a wooden rifle prepare to attempt something that most of them would have considered impossible. Caldwell's finger rested lightly on the trigger. There was no visible tension in his body, no strain or stress. He seemed to have merged with the weapon, become part of the system, rather than simply operating it. His eyes never left the scope, but somehow he appeared to be seeing beyond the glass, beyond the target, into some deeper understanding of trajectory and wind and gravity that existed outside normal human perception. The first shot broke with a sharp crack that echoed off the valley walls. The rifle's recoil was smooth, Caldwell's body absorbing the energy with practiced efficiency. He worked the bolt without taking his eye from the scope, the muscle memory so ingrained that his hands seemed to operate independently of conscious thought. For 4 long seconds, nothing happened. The bullet was in flight, invisible, traveling at over 2,800 feet per second, but still requiring time to cover the vast distance to target. Then the electronic panel at 3,200 meters flashed bright green. A perfect hit, dead center. Corporal Bennett actually gasped out loud. Caldwell didn't react to the hit. His breathing remained steady, his position unchanged. He loaded another round with the same deliberate care. "Watch the wind flags," Raleigh whispered to Colonel Patterson. "He's waiting for the pattern to repeat." Sure enough, the flags downrange began to flutter in the same sequence they'd shown 30 seconds earlier. The wind was breathing, and Caldwell had learned its rhythm. The second shot cracked out. 4 seconds of flight time. Green flash. Another perfect hit. General Addison's face showed no surprise, only satisfied confirmation. She'd seen Caldwell shoot before, decades ago, when she'd been a young captain assigned to evaluate experimental weapons programs. She'd never forgotten watching him put 10 consecutive rounds through a playing card at 2,000 meters with a rifle he'd built from salvaged parts. Third shot. Same preparation, same controlled breathing, same impossible patience. The rifle cracked. 4 seconds. Green flash. Vaughan's hands had begun to tremble slightly. He was watching his entire understanding of marksmanship being rewritten by a man old enough to be his grandfather, using equipment that belonged in a museum. Fourth shot. Green flash, fifth shot. Green flash. Caldwell paused, his hand resting on the bolt. He lifted his head from the scope and glanced at the sky, noting a subtle change in the cloud cover that was altering the air density fractionally. He waited 10 seconds, 15, letting the conditions stabilize. Sixth shot, green flash. He was shooting faster now, having established the rhythm. Seventh shot, green flash. Eighth shot, green flash. Private Briggs had pulled out his phone again, but this time not to mock. His hand shook as he recorded footage that would indeed go to the battalion group chat, but the caption would be very different from what he'd originally planned. Ninth shot. Green flash. Caldwell chambered the 10th and final round from his ammunition box. This time, he took even longer, his breathing slowing to an almost meditative state. The entire range seemed to breathe with him, drawn into the rhythm of his preparation. The final shot cracked out across the Virginia morning. 4 seconds of suspended reality. Then the distant electronic panel flashed green one last time. 10 shots. 10 hits at 3,200 meters. With a wooden rifle built 50 years ago, Caldwell safed his weapon and slowly stood up, his joints protesting slightly after the prone position. He turned to face General Addison with a small, quiet smile. "Rifle still shoots straight, Claire." Addison nodded, her expression carrying a mixture of respect and something that might have been emotion. "That it does, James, that it does." She turned to face Vaughn and his team, all of whom looked like they'd just watched someone walk on water. "Gentlemen," she said quietly, "you've just witnessed something that most Marines will never see in their entire careers. You've seen what true mastery looks like. Not the mastery that comes from expensive equipment or the latest technology, but the mastery that comes from 50 years of dedication to a craft." The morning sun had climbed higher, burning off the last of the mist and illuminating the range in sharp, unforgiving detail. In that light, Vaughn's expensive tactical gear and modern rifles looked somehow hollow, all flash and no substance compared to the quiet competence of the old man with the wooden rifle. The demonstration was over, but the real lesson was just beginning. 3 weeks had passed since the demonstration at Range 14 Charlie. The Virginia autumn had begun to assert itself, turning the dense forests surrounding Quantico into a tapestry of crimson, gold, and amber. The morning air carried a new crispness, a hint of the winter that would eventually follow. Staff Sergeant Marcus Vaughn sat alone in the base library's military history section, a place he'd never visited during his entire time at Quantico. The library was nearly empty at 0630 hours. Most Marines were either in morning PT or grabbing breakfast at the Chow Hall. But Vaughn had been arriving early for the past 2 weeks, driven by something he couldn't quite name. Shame, perhaps. Curiosity, certainly. But more than that, a gnawing need to understand what he'd missed, what he'd been too arrogant to see. The table before him was covered with documents, books, and printouts. He'd started with the official histories, sanitized accounts of Marine Corps operations in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Those had been interesting but frustratingly vague, filled with redacted sections and footnotes that referenced classified annexes he couldn't access. Then he discovered the oral history archives, recordings of interviews with Vietnam-era Marines, conducted decades after the fact when classification restrictions had been lifted. That's when things got interesting. One recording in particular had stopped him cold. An interview with a former Force Reconnaissance Marine named Sullivan, conducted in 2003. The old Marine's voice had been rough with age and cigarettes, but his memory had been sharp. "We called him the Phantom," Sullivan's voice crackled through Vaughn's headphones. "He wasn't one of us. Wasn't regular military at all by the time I met him. He was something else. DoD brought him in when we had situations that required specialized solutions." The interviewer's voice. "Can you elaborate on what you mean by specialized solutions?" A long pause on the recording, then Sullivan continued. "There was an NVA colonel running operations out of a village complex near the Laotian border. Smart bastard. Never stayed in one place long enough for conventional targeting. He'd disrupted 3 of our operations, cost us good men. Command wanted him eliminated, but standard sniper teams couldn't get close enough. The terrain was too open, too well defended." Another pause. "They brought in Caldwell. He went in alone with that wooden rifle of his. We thought the command had lost their minds. This civilian consultant had to be pushing 40 years old at the time, walking into an NVA-controlled zone with a rifle that looked like it belonged in a frontier museum. What happened? He was gone for 6 days. We thought he was dead. Then he walked back into camp looking like he'd been through hell, dehydrated, exhausted, covered in leeches. Said the job was done. 3 days later, intelligence confirmed that the NVA colonel and his entire command staff had been eliminated. 7 confirmed kills, all at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters. With that wooden rifle, Vaughn had listened to that interview 4 times now. Each time finding new details he'd missed before, he moved on to another. Document, a declassified after-action report from Operation Desert Storm. A Marine sniper instructor named Castellano had written about advanced training he'd received in 1989. Just before the Gulf War deployment, the civilian contractor who taught our advanced course changed everything I thought I knew about long-range shooting, Castellano had written. He showed us that the equipment was secondary to understanding the fundamentals, while we were obsessing over the latest scope technology and match-grade ammunition. He was teaching us to read terrain, to understand wind patterns at multiple distances simultaneously, to calculate holdover using landmarks instead of relying entirely on electronic rangefinders. The report continued. On the final day of the course, he outshot our entire class using a rifle he'd built himself from parts that included wood furniture, salvaged from a Vietnam-era M14. At 2,000 meters, while we were achieving 60–70% hit rates with our M40A1s, he put 10 consecutive rounds into a target the size of a dinner plate. When asked how he'd achieved such precision with what appeared to be inferior equipment, he simply said, "The weapon doesn't make the shooter. The shooter makes the weapon." Vaughn closed his eyes, remembering his own words on the range 3 weeks ago. That wooden toy might be fine for shooting cans off a fence post, but it has no business on a professional military range. The memory made his stomach turn. He opened another file, this one more recent, a Marine Corps Gazette article from 2015 about the evolution of sniper doctrine. The author, a colonel who'd served as the director of the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School, had written extensively about the influence of civilian consultants on military training programs. One section in particular stood out. Among the most influential figures in the development of modern Marine Corps precision shooting doctrine was James Caldwell, a civilian consultant whose operational history spans 5 decades. Caldwell's contributions include the mathematical models for wind drift calculation, still taught today, the development of range estimation techniques using reticle-based systems, and pioneering work in ultra-long-range shooting that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. The article included a photograph. It showed a younger Caldwell, maybe in his 50s, standing beside a group of Marines at what looked like a desert training facility. He was holding the wooden rifle, and the Marines around him were looking at him with expressions of clear respect. One of those Marines, Vaughn realized with a start, was a young lieutenant whose face looked familiar. He checked the photo caption. Lieutenant Patterson receives instruction from civilian consultant James Caldwell, 1998. Patterson, Colonel William Patterson, the current base commander who'd arrived at the range in that convoy 3 weeks ago. The same officer who'd promised Vaughn the most unpleasant conversation of his Marine Corps career. That conversation had indeed been unpleasant. Patterson hadn't shouted, hadn't threatened, hadn't even raised his voice. He'd simply asked Vaughn a series of questions that had progressively dismantled every assumption the young sergeant had held about competence, respect, and what it meant to be a professional warrior. What made you think you had the right to judge that man's capabilities? Patterson had asked, his voice quiet but intense. Was it his age? His equipment? The fact that he didn't wear a uniform? Vaughn had stammered something about maintaining standards, about safety concerns, about protocol. Patterson had let him finish, then leaned forward across his desk. Staff Sergeant, I learned more about shooting in 2 weeks with James Caldwell than I learned in my first 10 years as a Marine. That man forgot more about marksmanship before you were born than you'll learn in your entire career. And you mocked him. You dismissed him. You let your arrogance blind you to the presence of a living legend. The conversation had ended with Vaughn being assigned to write a comprehensive research paper on the history of civilian consultants in military training programs. You will learn who these people are, what they've contributed, and why they deserve respect, Patterson had said. And when you're done, you'll understand why what you did was not just disrespectful, it was ignorant. So Vaughn had researched and learned and felt progressively smaller with each new piece of information he uncovered. He'd discovered that Caldwell had trained over 400 military snipers across multiple branches of service. He'd learned about operations in Chad, Somalia, and Kosovo, where Caldwell had served as an advisor, helping special operations teams achieve objectives that conventional forces couldn't accomplish. He'd read testimony from Marines who credited Caldwell's training with saving their lives in combat, and he'd learned about the wooden rifle. It wasn't just a rifle. It was a philosophy made tangible. Caldwell had built it in 1971 during an extended mission in Southeast Asia, when his military-issued weapon had been damaged beyond repair. Using hand tools, salvaged wood from packing crates, and a damaged rifle barrel he'd painstakingly restored, he'd created a weapon that met his exact specifications. The wood hadn't been chosen for aesthetics. It had been chosen because it was available, because it could be shaped precisely, because it was light enough to carry on extended patrols, but rigid enough to maintain accuracy. That rifle had become legendary among the small community of people who knew about such things. It had been used in operations that would never be officially acknowledged. It had achieved kills at ranges that were still classified, and it had proven time and again that the skill of the shooter mattered infinitely more than the price tag of the equipment. Vaughn heard footsteps approaching through the library stacks. He looked up, then froze. James Caldwell stood at the end of the aisle, a stack of books under one arm. The old man looked surprised to see someone in this section so early in the morning. For a moment, neither man moved. Then Vaughn stood up so quickly his chair scraped loudly against the floor, the sound echoing through the quiet library like a gunshot. His heart hammered in his chest, his mouth suddenly dry. This was the moment he'd been simultaneously hoping for and dreading, a chance to make this right. To apologize properly, to show that he'd learned something from his humiliation, but now that the moment was here, he found himself terrified that no apology could possibly be adequate for what he'd done. The silence in the library aisle felt suffocating. Vaughn's heart pounded so loudly he was certain Caldwell could hear it. Every muscle in his body was tense, coiled with the kind of nervous energy that came from knowing this moment would define something fundamental about who he was as a Marine and as a man. "Mr. Caldwell," Vaughn began, his voice rough with emotion. "Sir, I owe you an apology that I know I can never fully make right." Caldwell set his books down on a nearby cart, his movements unhurried. He turned to face Vaughn directly, those pale blue eyes steady and unblinking. "I was completely out of line on that range," Vaughn continued, the words tumbling out now that he'd started. "Everything I said, everything I did, mocking your rifle, questioning your credentials, trying to force you off the range. It was arrogant and disrespectful and wrong." He swallowed hard. "I've spent 3 weeks reading about what you've done for this Corps, the lives you've saved, the Marines you've trained, and all I can think about is how blind I was. How stupid." Caldwell walked slowly to the table where Vaughn's research materials were spread out. He picked up the Marine Corps Gazette article, glanced at the photograph of himself from 1998, and set it back down gently. "You read all of this?" Caldwell asked, his gravelly voice neutral. "Yes, sir. Every page I could get my hands on. The oral histories, the after-action reports, the training manuals. I even tracked down 3 Marines who trained under you in the 90s. They all said the same thing. That you changed how they understood their craft. Caldwell nodded slowly, then gestured to the chairs. Sit down, Staff Sergeant. Vaughan obeyed immediately, his back rigid despite being seated. Caldwell eased himself into the opposite chair with the careful movements of a man whose body carried decades of hard use. Let me tell you a story, Caldwell said. In 1972, I was working with a SEAL team in the Mekong Delta. I thought I was hot stuff. I'd made shots that other snipers said were impossible. I'd survived situations that killed better men. I was 27 years old and convinced I'd figured it all out. He paused, his eyes distant with memory. There was a Vietnamese scout working with us. Old man had to be in his 60s. Carried a French rifle from the First Indochina War. Bolt-action MAS-36, obsolete even then. The SEALs treated him like a mascot, a local curiosity. I did too, if I'm being honest. Caldwell's fingers drummed once on the table. One night, we got pinned down by a VC sniper operating from a tree line about 800 meters out. This guy was good. He'd already dropped 2 of our point men. I set up with my rifle, state-of-the-art suppressed system, night vision optics. Spent 40 minutes trying to locate this sniper and couldn't get a clean shot. Vaughan leaned forward slightly, drawn into the story despite himself. That old Vietnamese scout tapped me on the shoulder, pointed at a specific tree in the darkness. I looked through my scope, couldn't see anything. He took his ancient French rifle, no scope at all, just iron sights, and put a round exactly where he'd pointed. The VC sniper fell out of that tree dead. Caldwell's eyes refocused on Vaughan. I asked him how he knew. You know what he told me. You were looking with your equipment. I was listening with my experience. He'd heard the sniper's breathing rhythm, tracked it by sound, understood the pattern of the shots well enough to locate him without ever seeing him. The old man leaned back in his chair. I learned more in that one moment than I had in 5 years of training. I learned that technology is a tool, not a replacement for knowledge. And I learned that dismissing someone because their methods look different from yours is the fastest way to stay ignorant. Vaughan felt heat rise in his face. That's exactly what I did to you. Yes, it is, Caldwell agreed, but his tone wasn't harsh. But you're sitting here now, which means you're capable of growth. That puts you ahead of where I was at your age. It took me getting someone killed before I learned to shut up and listen. The weight of those words settled over the table like a physical presence. The wooden rifle, Caldwell continued, isn't just a weapon to me. It's a reminder that the fundamentals matter more than the accessories. Every time I pick it up, I'm forced to rely on pure skill, reading wind by feel, calculating distance by terrain features, timing shots by heartbeat instead of electronic triggers. It keeps me honest. He stood up slowly, gathering his books again. You want to know the real difference between a good shooter and a master? Caldwell asked. Yes, sir. A good shooter knows his equipment inside and out. A master knows himself inside and out. The rifle is just an extension of understanding of physics, environment, your own body, your own limitations. Caldwell's eyes held Vaughan's gaze. You've got solid skills, Staff Sergeant. I could see that even before all the unpleasantness. But skills without humility are dangerous. They make you overconfident. They make you dismiss threats you should respect. Vaughan stood as well, coming to attention. Mr. Caldwell, I know I have no right to ask this, but would you be willing to teach me? Not just shooting technique, but the way you think about the craft? Caldwell studied him for a long moment. Then something that might have been approval flickered across his weathered face. Saturday morning, range 14 Charlie. 0700 hours. Bring your wooden toy rifle and your team. The hint of a smile touched Caldwell's lips at his own callback to Vaughan's insult. We'll be there, sir. And sir? Vaughan's voice caught slightly. Thank you for your service, for your patience, for giving me a chance I don't deserve. Caldwell placed one weathered hand on Vaughan's shoulder, the first physical contact between them that wasn't confrontational. Every master was once a student who made mistakes, Staff Sergeant. The question isn't whether you stumble, it's whether you get back up and learn from it. He squeezed Vaughan's shoulder once, then released it. You're getting back up. That's what matters. As Caldwell walked away through the library stacks, his footsteps quiet on the worn carpet, Vaughan remained standing at attention until the old man disappeared from view. Then he sat back down slowly, looking at the research materials spread before him with new eyes. The lesson had been brutal, public, and absolutely necessary, but it had been learned. And now, impossibly, he'd been given the opportunity to learn even more, directly from a living legend who'd chosen grace over grudges. Vaughan pulled out his phone and opened the group chat with his team. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before he began typing. Saturday, 0700, range 14 Charlie. Mandatory. We've been given a second chance. Don't waste it. He hit send, then looked back at the documents one more time. Somewhere in the stacks, James Caldwell was selecting books on advanced ballistics theory. And somewhere in the future, a group of humbled Marines would begin the real journey toward mastery, taught by a man with a wooden rifle and 5 decades of hard-earned wisdom. The morning sun continued its climb over Quantico, illuminating a new beginning built on the foundation of a hard lesson learned. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.